Assalamu alaikum students. Today the topic that we're going to discuss is definition of psychology and its scope. To understand or study any branch of knowledge, it is important to completely understand its definition first. Especially, there are many misconceptions about subject psychology. So, to better understand what the subject psychology is all about, what is its subject matter? What are the research methods involved? Let's discuss its definition. The word psychology is a Greek word. It's a combination of two Greek words, psyche and logos. Psyche means soul, mind, or self, and logos means knowledge. So basically, psychology is the knowledge of soul, mind, or self. So there are many definitions of psychology. Let's have a look at these definitions. First of all, let's define psychology as the science of soul. Soul is a concept that is very familiar to us, but we cannot describe it because it's something that we cannot see or feel or touch. So, when about describing psychology as the science of soul, we see that there are many concepts about it. There had been many different philosophers, especially in ancient Greece. Psychology was defined as the science of soul, and various philosophers of that age described soul in their own way. Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher. He gave the concept that soul is imprisoned in the body and death frees the soul from its prison cell. And after death, soul can move around freely. He believed in the transmigration of soul. So basically, according to Pythagoras, soul was immortal. There was no death to a soul. In fact, it transfers from one world to the other, while body is mortal. Socrates, another very famous philosopher, was the first one to use the word psyche for soul. He believed that soul is superior to body because soul is immortal and body is mortal. Body is made up of matter in this material world which has come to an end. He also regarded that acquisition of knowledge is very important for purification of soul, while ignorance can pollute it. Plato was of the opinion that soul and body are two distinct systems. They both continue functioning until a person breathes. After one has taken one's dying breath, soul leaves body. In other words, soul survives the death of body. Plato also believed that soul is a shadow that can be felt but whose reality cannot be known. Aristotle, a very great philosopher, he speculated that soul is the living principle in all animate beings. Aristotle is also known as the first psychologist because he wrote on topics which form the subject matter of psychology today. He wrote many books. One of his books, De Anima, is very famous, which is the first book on psychology. Apart from Greek philosophers, there are also many European scholars who also speculated on the concept of soul during the Middle Ages. Plotinus, Saint Augustine are one of those. According to Saint Augustine, soul to be immortal and human body is inferior and mortal. Other than European psychologists, many Muslim scholars and ulama also discussed this concept of soul in the light of Islamic teachings. Al-Kindi, Farabi, Avicenna, all these Muslim scholars, they also agreed on the immortality of the soul. All held that body and soul are separate and distinct entities. They highlighted the Islamic concept of soul. If we critically analyze the definition of psychology as the study of soul, when we look at this concept of soul in the historical perspective, it indicates that the notion of the soul was well known in all ages in some form or the other, and almost all the thinkers regarded it as immortal. But if we define psychology as the science of soul, we have to face many difficulties. Keeping in mind that if psychology is a science, science is based on observations and explanations and experimentations, while soul cannot be observed. Soul is immaterial, it cannot be seen or felt. So we cannot perform any experiment on it and we cannot prove it scientifically. Soul is a religious concept, while science should not be restricted to religion only. Therefore, we cannot rely completely on this definition of psychology as the science of soul. Soul is not a universal concept. People of different religions and cultures take a different view of soul, which is also unscientific. Now let's move on to our another definition of psychology, which is psychology is the science of mind. When we talk about mind, how we define mind itself? Mind is the sum total of a person's psychic states. It includes emotion, feelings, consciousness, unconsciousness, and different emotions, thinking processes, and other mental processes that are going on within the mind. The way brain reacts or responds to a stimulus is also influenced by mind. Many Greek philosophers they also identified soul with mind. If we look at the concepts given by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we see that they also believed and they also introduced the concept of mind. Like Plato introduced the concept of mind and considered mind identical with soul. Aristotle thought that mind is the function of body, and he considered mind superior to body. And he also asserted that mental processes are caused by environmental factors. In 17th century, John Locke repudiated the idea that mind and soul are identical with each other. He thought that soul is a religious term whereas mind is a psychological concept. According to him, mind at birth is like a blank sheet without any ideas. And he used this term tabula rasa. He gave this concept which is called tabula rasa, which means blank slate. After birth, different theories, senses, experiences begin to imprint their images on the sheet. And individual organizes these imprints which in turn condition his impressions and feelings about a particular event, situation or person. In 18th century, when psychology began to be studied objectively, mind was equated with mental processes. The reason was that mind in itself is nothing. It's actually the mental processes that are going on we can know about a person. There are different aspects of mental processes. Some important three aspects of mental processes are cognition, cognition, and affection. Now let's discuss these aspects. Cognition. Cognition basically refers to cognitive or mental processes. In simple words, cognition is acquiring knowledge, learning something, getting to know something, and developing or understanding other matters. This is called cognition. And without cognition, we cannot know about anything. Cognition is a dynamic aspect of mental processes. The action or the responses that take place in reaction to some drive or urge is called cognition. The desire or impulse to get something is termed as cognition. So basically, cognition is that force within the body that motivates to react or to respond or uh, to achieve some urge. And affection. The third aspect of mental process is affection. One's feelings about some situation, even to think, is called affection. Now, affection or feelings can be positive, feelings could be negative, they could be pleasant or unpleasant. So, basically, affection refers to the emotional state or emotional part. The nature and significance of these three aspects of mental processes varies from person to person. However, despite these individual differences, they are present in every person. So basically, every individual is categorized by having these three aspects of mental processes. No matter, it may vary from person to person, but they do exist in all of them. Now, moving on, William Wundt was the first person who established the first laboratory of psychology. He also emphasized the importance of study of mental processes, and he developed a very important method of studying psychology which is known as introspection. Titchener, he defines psychology as the science of mental processes. Now, different psychologists have postulated three aspects of mind. If we look at these aspects, we will come to know that mind has basically three different parts, you can say: conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. Now, conscious is that mental state or that part of the mind in which we are aware of at that moment. It is taken to mean immediate awareness. Subconscious. Certain conscious states make their way to subconscious and get stored there. We cannot access them immediately, that is, once the mental contents that are conscious leave the conscious, they become subconscious. It is the subconscious that lends color to our life. So, things that are not in our conscious for that particular moment are stored in the subconscious. Then comes the part unconscious. This is the part of the mind that we are not directly aware of. Our forgotten, repressed wishes go into that unconscious. Our memories, components that cannot be retrieved or accessed at will. The content in the unconscious can be brought back through psychoanalysis or hypnotism. So basically, our guilt feelings, unfulfilled desires, old memories, old childhood experiences, they become part of unconscious. Now, looking at the characteristics of mind, mind is active and sensitive to all types of experiences or stimuli. Mind is continuous. Present, past, future experiences form a continuity which is broken only in case of an accident or mental illness. So basically, it's dynamic, it keeps on moving and changing. Mind is a complete unit. Mental processes such as imagination, thinking, feeling, they do not function independently of one another. We analyze them in isolation for the sake of study, otherwise, they are interconnected in mind. All our mental processes are actually interconnected and they affect each other in some way or the other. Mind is non matter. Mind is a terminology. It has no physical existence as such. We cannot say that it is matter. It is a non matter. Brain is made up of flesh and has weight, no doubt. Mind is related to brain, but it is immaterial. So basically, mind is a concept. It is a terminology that we use for the different mental processes which are going on. Mental processes are subjective and peculiar to every person. Individual has immediate access to his mental processes. So basically, mental processes are personal, they are private. Mental processes go on non-stop. They are dynamic, they continue. There is no break in our mental life. So Much so, our mind remains busy or active even when we are asleep. Having dreams is a case in point. While we sleep, we see dreams, which means that our mind is even then active at that time when we are sleeping. Though during sleep, mental activity slow down, but it does not stop. Tishner is of the view that mental processes not only continue all the time but also undergo change. Our mental states keep on changing. So, definitely, at one point we think about one thing, and the other time, immediately after that, we start thinking about something else, which means that it keeps on changing. Our thoughts, our thinking process, it keeps on changing. If we call psychology or if we define psychology as a science of mental processes instead of science of mind, this definition is acceptable to a large extent. This definition is better than calling psychology the science of soul. Nevertheless, a few objections have been made. The criticism which is made while defining psychology as the science of mental processes is the mental processes can be observed only subjectively. No person has direct access to someone else's mental processes. Since mental processes go on all the time, they can neither be examined nor verified because the mental processes are not constant. Like soul, mind is also immaterial. It has no substance. We cannot perform scientific experiments on it without seeing or feeling it. If psychology is mere science of mental processes, then animals, babies, and mentally sick person will have to be excluded from its scope because they cannot be studied with their own mental processes. And one has to believe other in order to know their mental states. So animal cannot express themselves, whereas the account given by babies and mental patients cannot be relied on. So on account of these objections and keeping these demerits in mind, psychology cannot be completely defined as a science of mind only. That is why psychologists have been trying to improve its definition from time to time. Let's move on to another definition which defines psychology as a science of consciousness. As we have earlier described, consciousness at that part of mind in which we are aware of. Immediate awareness, the part of mind which refers to the immediate awareness. If psychology is called science of consciousness, it will imply that psychology is concerned with an individual's conscious states. John Dewey, an American psychologist, defined psychology as a science of consciousness. He suggested that consciousness is always goal oriented and the individual can analyze his consciousness himself. William James, who was an American psychologist, who also called psychology as a science of consciousness, he also used the term stream of consciousness. He said that psychology is concerned with the flow of conscious thoughts. He described consciousness as a subjective state that provides us awareness of our mental processes. He further divided consciousness into two parts: focal consciousness and marginal consciousness. The part of consciousness which is the focus of attention is called focal consciousness, and the part other than focal consciousness is called marginal consciousness. Psychologists are agreed that consciousness is a part of mind. However, besides consciousness, mind has other parts as well, that is subconscious and unconscious. The supporters of subconscious and unconscious contend that consciousness forms a tiny portion of mind. Moreover, consciousness has all the attributes that characterize mind. So, if we completely rely on this definition and if we define psychology as the science of consciousness, that then all the demerits that we have discussed earlier cannot be ruled out. Psychology as the science of consciousness opposed to science of mind or mental processes is to narrow it down even further. So this definition cannot be considered authentic because of the objections like mind and soul. Consciousness is also unscientific term and concept, and consciousness and states of consciousness cannot be studied scientifically. These experiences are also subjective, and person can be aware of only her own conscious state, and no one else can study it as precisely and accurately as the person himself. And if we consider psychology as the study of consciousness only, then we would exclude subconscious and unconscious, which are also very important part of our mental process or our mind. In other words, if we're studying a small part, we are ignoring a very large part. Like mental processes, conscious state of animal, children, and patients, that cannot be analyzed as well. Psychology is a science which is concerned with the study and observation of all living organisms. Calling it science of consciousness will limit its range and scope drastically. That is why this definition could not win wider acceptance. Now, coming to our fourth definition of psychology, which is psychology as science of behavior. First of all, let's define behavior. Behavior refers to all the outward acts and actions of a living organism. Behavior comes in response to a stimulus. Behavior of an organism, the way organism behaves to its external environment or to the stimuli that are present in its surroundings or in its external environment. Behavior is something which is observable. It is something which can be seen, it is something which can be experimented. So, if we consider behavior as the subject matter in psychology, its scope actually extends to a greater extent. In response to objections made to previous definitions of psychology, it was called science of behavior because it gained wider currency. Now, let's discuss psychologists who introduced psychology as a science of behavior. Thorndike is one very important psychologist. He performed many experiments on animals. He studied their behavior objectively and introduced the concept of learning through trial and error. He also explained law of exercise, law of effect, and law of reinforcement. So, Thorndike is basically called the first behaviorist in psychology. J.B. Watson. Watson was not only introduced psychology as a science of behavior, but also earned full recognition of behaviorist approach. He considered study of behavior essential for objective and scientific study of organism. He pioneered the method of outward observation. Watson asserted that an individual's physical, social, and psychological problems can be studied through outward observations. He criticized those who held psychology to be science of mind and consciousness, and he labeled introspection as absurd and excluded it from psychology. Pavlov and Skinner, they also conducted many experiments on animals in order to control their behavior and originated the concept of conditioning as well as the process of reward and punishment. So, all the behavioristic approach, if seen closely, we will understand that why behavior was considered an important subject matter at that time, just because of the characteristics that behavior can be observed, it can be experimented. Many of the behaviorists they came up with this idea and they focused and believed in considering behavior should be the subject matter of psychology. Watson also applied the methods of Pavlov and Skinner to human behavior. So through different experiments, human behavior can be controlled or conditioned. So basically the scope or the goals or objectives in psychology were to basically describe and explain behavior, to control it, and to predict it. And through all the experiments done by the behaviorist It was proved that behavior can be controlled and it can be predicted. So basically, Watson believed that a person can learn good or bad habits from his environment. A person can learn and also unlearn. He carried out successful experiments on children animals and he presented stimulus response formula. Now, stimulus response formula was criticized and it was contended that this formula is inadequate as long as organism is not included in it. And this formula was amended and it was reformulated as stimulus organism response SOR. In other words, it is the organism that is influenced by the stimulus and that exhibits reaction. So Watson defined psychology as the science of behavior and discarded the concepts like introspection, consciousness, soul, and mind, labeling them as unscientific. He said that, like other experimental sciences, psychology has no room for concepts like mind and consciousness. Pavlov was a Russian psychologist and he originated the method of classical conditioning, which facilitated and popularized the theory of controlling conditioning human behavior through various forms of reward and punishment. Skinner also introduced method of operant conditioning. He also demonstrated that how we can bring living organisms under control by conditioning their behavior. So all the experiments done by these behaviorists gave a very strong support to this idea that behavior can be controlled and it can be predicted and it can be modified. The exponents of behaviorism are called behaviorist thinkers. Watson held that both aspects of learned and unlearned behavior, as displayed in what one says and does, have great importance for a behaviorist. In labs, proper scientific studies were concluded on animals and babies, and various studies were initiated to predict behavior. Besides this, physiological systems like nervous system, sensations, glands were also brought under examination. Despite the fact that behaviorist approach covers much that is included in psychology, there were few objections that were made. The criticism that was done was Watson attached too much importance to behavior and discarded mental processes completely. Stimulus response theory interrupts human behavior mechanically, which is objectionable, and feelings and emotions have been completely ignored. The value of conditioning individuals' behavior under environmental factors has been underlined, whereas such an important element as inner drive has been ignored as well. All psychological states cannot be interpreted through SOR only. It's not possible to ignore the study of mind altogether and focus all attention on behavior only. To sum up the discussion and to better define psychology, we can come to this conclusion that the psychology on its own cannot be study of behavior only, and all the mental processes and the part of mind, emotional feelings, thinkings cannot be ignored while considering or while defining psychology. So one can say that if the study of mental processes along with behavior is also included in this definition, the problem can be solved. Now we come to a comprehensive definition of psychology, which is the best definition as well, which defines psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes of the organism. In its scientific study of an individual's behavior and mental processes is carried out in the perspective of his environment. Now the question is psychology a science? If we look at the goals of psychology, which are to give explanation of behavior, to control behavior, and to predict behavior, we see that yes, the methods involved in psychology are very organized, systematic, and standardized. So we can say that psychology is a science because science itself is not a subject, it's just a method of study. It's a standard procedure to arrange and organize information while using controlled conditions and to study and analyze under a controlled environment or labs and information where information is examined objectively. So, methods involved in the study of psychology are very much objective and they are standardized. So, we can say that psychology is a science.